One of my favorite philosophers of all time is Socrates. And to understand what makes him so special, let's look at an excerpt from his dialogue with Theaetetus, who was a mathematician in ancient Greece. In this dialogue, the two Athenians discuss what is knowledge, and Theaetetus attempts to define knowledge as nothing other than perception. But consider this: don't you say seeing is perceiving and sight is perception? I do. And someone who has seen something has acquired knowledge of that which he has seen, according to what we said just now. Yes. What about this? Do you agree that there is such a thing as memory? Yes. And is it memory of nothing or of something? Of something, surely. Of things one has learned or perceived. Isn't it memory of things of this sort? What else could it be? Does a person, on occasion, remember what he has seen? He remembers. And does he forget it when his eyes are closed? What an odd thing to say, Socrates. Yet we must say so if we are to salvage our previous argument. Otherwise, it is eliminated. Yes, by Zeus, that's what I suspect too. But I don't quite understand why. So you tell me. Well, we say that whoever is seeing comes to have knowledge of that which he is seeing. For we have agreed that sight, perception, and knowledge are the same. Yes, indeed. And yet, the person who sees and has come to have knowledge of what he has seen does not see it when his eyes are closed, though he does remember it. Is this so? Yes. But does not see is the same as does not know, if in fact to see is to know. True. So it turns out that someone who has come to know something and still remembers it does not know it, since he does not see it. And we said it would be bizarre if this were the case. What you say is very true. Then an impossible conclusion appears to follow if someone says that knowledge and perception are the same. So it seems. So we have to say that they are different. Very likely. Well, in that case, whatever is knowledge? It seems we must discuss this again from the beginning. In this excerpt, Socrates appears to have disproved Theaetetus's definition of knowledge as perception. This general approach is known as Socratic questioning and is used in law to complete the cross-examination of a witness, and also psychotherapy, to name just a few examples of how we still use this approach in modern society. Socrates would use this approach to dissect normative or philosophical beliefs that people had in Athens. Socrates was really famous in his time and was declared the wisest person in Athens according to the oracle at Delphi. In Plato's Apology, Socrates says, "Well, although I do not suppose that either of us know anything really beautiful and good, I am better off than he is, for he knows nothing and thinks that he knows. I neither know nor think that I know. In this latter particular, then, I seem to be slightly more wise than him." Socrates is basically saying that because he doesn't think that he knows anything really valuable at all, that makes him the wisest person in Athens compared to everyone else who seems to think that they know important things about the world. Socrates was famous for tearing down other people's beliefs and believed there were very real limitations on knowledge and what we can know, and this qualifies him as a skeptic. The goal of this video is to explore skepticism and ultimately to think about, where does skepticism fit in modern society? How should skepticism impact your own thought process? And we'll explore the intimate relationship between skepticism and science. Before we continue, this is a friendly reminder to like, comment, subscribe to the channel, and in the description of each video, you'll find a link to my Patreon, where you can watch music-free versions of the videos and donate to the channel. While we're on the topic of Socratic skepticism, it's a good time to consider the risks associated with skepticism in general. For Socrates, his skepticism had deadly results, and this was explored more in Plato's Apology, where after habitually undermining social norms and beliefs, Socrates was put on trial for corrupting the youth by the Athenian state. It's a long story that I won't get into here, but ultimately Socrates received capital punishment for his skepticism and famously died by drinking poison hemlock. To understand why people react so severely to effective skeptics like Socrates, I suspect it relates to our tribal nature. For most of human history, our ancestors existed in small tribes, and many psychologists believe that this evolutionary history still impacts us to this day. Maybe the most obvious way that tribalism could be influencing humanity is to look at how polarized we are politically. One study looked at how people on social media can be alienated if they refuse to share fake news. Even though I'm left-leaning politically, I'm sure some people might categorize me as right-leaning if they watched my video on evolutionary psychology. But on a positive note, some research suggests that we can overcome tribalist perceptions of others using compassion-focused therapy. For a long time, I didn't like participating in gossip with friends and coworkers, but in similar ways, it might have some social advantages. For example, it might be able to facilitate building and configuring social ties and increase friendship and trust. Individuals may also use gossip as a means to share and compare their impressions of other individuals, both to regulate and understand their own feelings as well as clarify acceptable normative behavior. On a similar note, one time an ex-girlfriend came home telling me a story about how a guy cut her off in traffic and then proceeded to follow her through several intersections as the road rage between the two of them escalated. However, I had been in the car with her in several other road rage incidents and knew that she had a really bad temper. I asked her, "Are you sure there's nothing you did to escalate this situation?" And she was like, "What? You're my boyfriend. You're supposed to be on my side." I was surprised by how upset she got at me, but now I know that wasn't the time or place to practice skepticism. One of the things you might have noticed in the Apology is that Socrates made a note that he doesn't know anything that's beautiful or good. And Socrates' skepticism tends to cast doubt on assumptions about major philosophical topics like knowledge, virtue, citizenship, justice, morality, love, and the soul. Fast forward thousands of years later, and René Descartes forces us into a form of skepticism that goes a lot further. Descartes wanted to test what we could know for sure, and so he created a thought experiment where he tried to cast as much doubt as possible about what we know is true. I covered this in more detail in my Meaning of Life video, but an example that he brought up in his thought experiment was that during a dream, you might think that what you're experiencing is real, but in actuality, it's not. And there's no way of knowing whether the experiences that you're having at any given moment are a dream or in fact reality. The same could be said of hallucinations, no matter what they're caused by. I made a video about how using psychedelics caused me to hallucinate, but there are other sources in which you could also hallucinate, and often people who are hallucinating don't know the difference between reality and what hallucinations are invented by their brain. A good example of this is someone who suffers from schizophrenia. Descartes also discussed what he called an evil genius that might be manipulating every experience that a person is having. An example of this in popular culture is in the movie The Matrix, where the aliens are creating a completely alternative world that humans are plugged into and think that is real. All of these are examples of instances where we are tricked by our senses. We think what we're experiencing is real, but in actuality, it is not. Out of this thought experiment, Descartes came to one of the most famous conclusions in all of philosophical history. I think, therefore I am. All of the experiences that we perceive to be true might just be a figment of our imagination. But in order for their perceptions to happen, there must be a thing that is experiencing the perceptions. So even though all of the things that we're perceiving might not be real, we do know that the thing that is perceiving all of those experiences must exist. I think, therefore I am. And if you stay at this position and you continue to doubt whether all of the things external to you are possibly real or possibly not real, but you do know that you must exist because you are perceiving all of these other things, that is called epistemic solipsism. The belief that the only thing that you know with absolute certainty is that you exist. Descartes is not considered a skeptic, but the thought experiment that he outlined and the conclusion of I think, therefore I am, which ultimately leads to epistemic solipsism, is considered one of the most extreme forms of skepticism in philosophical history. And in strict terms, I do consider myself to be an epistemic solipsist. I really don't think we'll ever be able to prove that anything in our experiences are definitely real. Someone could always make the argument that your perception is a dream or that you are just a character in the Matrix. There is a long and detailed history of skeptical philosophy that I won't go into too much detail here, but skepticism did predate Socrates in Greece, but also in India and China. For example, it is a fundamental part of Buddhist philosophy. But one of the most famous, more recent skeptic philosophers is David Hume. He is the philosopher who invented the is-ought fallacy and used it to question morality in general. This is the fallacy that says just because something is a certain way doesn't necessarily mean that it ought to be that way. For example, someone might argue that humans are naturally a violent species, but that doesn't imply that humans ought to be violent. David Hume was an empiricist, meaning that all of our actual knowledge is based on sensory experience and empirical evidence, and therefore he was very skeptical of religion and any types of superstition. One of David Hume's biggest contributions, and the one we'll explore most in this video, is the assumption of cause and effect in scientific exploration. Let's consider the theory of gravity, for example. Humans might have all sorts of evidence that the theory of gravity exists, and we might even be able to come up with a gravitational constant. And scientists might have performed hundreds or thousands of different experiments that are consistent with the theory of gravity. None of the experiments they've done disproves that gravity is a real phenomenon. However, just because all of the experiments that we do seem to be consistent with the theory of gravity, we don't necessarily know that the theory of gravity is causing all of those experiments to go the way that they're going. Scientists invented the theory of gravity, but we don't know that all of the behavior that we see in our scientific experiments are caused by something in the universe that we could think about as being gravity. we'll come back to this idea in a moment. Philosophers get much deeper into the weeds in regards to skepticism and, more generally, the study of knowledge that they call epistemology. This philosophy, to me, is somewhat interesting, but I think it very quickly becomes convoluted, and I prefer to explore the limitations of human knowledge through neuroscience and psychology. There's been a lot of philosophical discussion about how to escape epistemic solipsism, or just generally where we should go from there. And again, epistemic solipsism is the idea that the only thing that we know with absolute certainty that exists in the universe is ourselves, or at least our thought at any given moment. The fact that we're thinking suggests that we do exist in some way, if it even is just that individual thought. And as an epistemic solipsist, it means that we really can't trust any of our senses. We can't trust all of the things that we see and all of the things that we hear, even things that we feel. None of those senses are necessarily telling us the truth. And many philosophers have used the idea of God in one way or another to restore faith in our senses. I mentioned that René Descartes also couldn't be identified as a skeptic because he didn't stop at epistemic solipsism. His argument for trusting our senses goes as follows. If I exist, then something must have created me. And if there's a separate other thing that created me, then that thing also must have been created by something else. So at this point, we know there's at least three different things in the universe. Me, the thing that created me, and the thing that created the thing that created me. And something else must have created that third thing. A fourth thing must have created the third thing. And you could keep going and going, but Descartes said that you can't go on forever. We can't infinitely go back and say that there's infinitely many things that created the other things. He argues that something must have created itself at some point. And the only thing that could have possibly created itself is God. The next line in his argument is that if there is a thing that has the power and ability to create itself, then it must be good. And if God is good, God would not deceive us. And if God is not deceiving us, then we should be able to trust all of the perceptions and senses that we have. And I think for most skeptics, there are many different assumptions in Descartes' argument that we could throw wrenches at. For example, if we go right back to the beginning of the argument, we are making a major assumption to say just because I exist, there must have been something else that created me. How do we know that all of the perceptions of one thing creating another thing, parents creating children, how do we know that all of those experiences that we've witnessed in our reality are actually true? Also, assuming that something did create me and something else created that thing, and on and on and on, it is a major assumption to say that that process of recreation couldn't go on forever. Or assuming that there is a God that created itself and then started those chain events of creation that ultimately led to me, it is another major assumption that God must be good. So there's all sorts of assumptions in here that a skeptic could reasonably doubt. And most philosophers don't consider Descartes' argument out of epistemic solipsism a valid argument. Ultimately, I don't think we can ever not doubt our sensory experiences. I think that our belief in our sensory experiences requires a certain level of faith and a practical outlook on life in general. So yes, I am saying that we should have faith in our sensory experience. And a big part of this argument, we could think about the idea of whether or not we should jump off the 20th floor balcony of an apartment building. If you are an epistemic solipsist, you could definitely cast doubt about whether there is actually any real height involved, whether you're really that high off the ground on the 20th floor balcony. And you could cast doubt about the hardness of the ground. Maybe the height is real, but if you jumped off the balcony and hit the ground would just be soft and absorb you when you fall. Maybe every other time that something has been thrown off a balcony and broken is just an illusion, and it won't necessarily happen again that way. Maybe you're Neo in the Matrix, and in actuality, you could fly. Maybe gravity is not real, and if you did step off the balcony, you wouldn't fall at all. Maybe it's just a coincidence that most people who jump off a balcony are hurt or die when they hit the ground. There are all sorts of assumptions that we make every time we decide not to jump off a balcony when we're given the opportunity. But of all the philosophical skeptics out there, and all of the epistemic solipsists like myself, how many people are confident enough to challenge all of these assumptions that we're making? How many epistemic solipsists are jumping off the 20th floor balcony? The answer is none of them, at least none as far as I know. And most likely, if philosophers are consistent in their behavior and doubt all of the different laws of the universe and traditional experiences that we have that warn us not to do anything that hurts ourselves, if those philosophers are challenging all of those assumptions, they're probably not around anymore. Also, we don't have any examples that we can think of where a human being has defied the law of gravity and magically just floated through the air. When I studied skepticism in school, I naturally just decided to have faith in my sensory perceptions, and I naturally gravitated to science as the best source of information available. I didn't realize until researching this video that philosophical skepticism from the likes of Descartes and Hume and other philosophers had an enormous impact on framing the philosophy that informed the scientific method. For example, centuries after Descartes and Hume were exploring skepticism, Karl Popper, who helped cement ideas around the scientific method, responded directly to Hume. I approached the problem of induction through Hume. Hume, I felt, was perfectly right in pointing out that induction cannot be logically justified. He's saying that the induction of scientific theories cannot be justified. For example, we cannot induce that the theory of gravity definitely exists just because all of the evidence that we have so far supports the theory. To think about this another way, just because the sun has risen every day, of course because of Earth's gravitational orbit around the sun, and we have witnessed this behavior as far back as we have been observing the sun's apparent motion around the Earth. It doesn't mean that we know with absolute certainty that the sun will rise again tomorrow. Popper argued that scientific theories are abstract in nature and can be tested only indirectly by reference to their implications. So, for example, if you're measuring the orbits of planets around the sun, you're not directly testing the theory of gravity, you're just indirectly testing that that planet's orbit around the sun is consistent with the theory of gravity. This brings us to Popper's idea of falsifiability. No number of positive outcomes at the level of experimental testing can confirm a scientific theory, but a single counterexample is logically decisive. A single counterexample would show that a theory is false. For For example, if there really was a person like Neo from the Matrix who was able to magically float or walk from one 20th floor balcony to another, it would cast serious doubts about our theory of gravity. This perspective demonstrates the intimate relationship between skepticism and the scientific method, where first a scientific theory is brought forward, or a hypothesis, and this hypothesis must be falsifiable and testable. Then initial experiments are used to verify that the hypothesis is not falsifiable. If that experiment is proved successful, it doesn't imply that the scientific theory is definitely true. What happens after that is countless other scientists attempt to replicate the test by copying the experiment and varying the environment in which the experiment is being conducted. So from this perspective, scientists should be inherently skeptical and constantly trying to make breakthroughs in how we understand the universe by introducing new theories or varying existing theories. And scientists are heavily incentivized to make breakthroughs. This is really how they would secure their fame and legacy and the success in their careers. And the longer that a theory survives all of these skeptical attacks, the stronger it's considered to be. If you've watched some of my other videos, you might have picked up that I find internet, lay people, science skeptics to be irritating. And as a philosophical skeptic, this reaction to internet science skeptics might seem hypocritical. But if you understand the scientific method and the rigor of the peer review process, then lay people, like non-professionally trained scientists who make claims that they did their own research and don't believe in major scientific theories, seem completely obnoxious and overconfident in their own intelligence. For example, someone who denies anthropogenic climate change, a theory that in the last decade has attracted a lot of scientific attention, and of the thousands of peer-reviewed scientific papers on the topic, over 99% of the studies in the last decade confirm the theory of anthropogenic climate change, the theory that people are causing climate change. And so hopefully it's clear how misleading Joe Rogan's climate skepticism is in clips like this one.
I think the climate change issue is very complicated. And I think, did you see the Washington Post piece that they wrote, where they did this long-term view? First of all, the reality is that the Earth's temperature has never been static, right? We could both agree on that. It's always been up and down. There's been ice ages and heat waves. And then the Washington Post looked at it. What was the time period that they looked at? That essentially they found that we're in a cooling period. That the Earth over the past X amount of years, and this was like a very inconvenient discovery, but they had to report the data, and kudos to them for doing that. Scientists have captured the Earth's climate change over the last 485 million years. Here's a surprising place we stand now. So look at the far end of that graph, and you see we're in a cooling period.
Well, I'm not sure. I didn't read that article, but
Yeah.
the scientists who are out there, I think.
I know, but there's a lot of money involved in that too, Bernie. That's part of the problem. There's a lot of money involved in this whole climate change emergency issue, and there's a lot of control, and that's a big part of this problem.
You might have also clocked this irritation in my evolutionary psychology video and my reaction to Mooncat's skepticism about evolutionary psychology. I also felt this way when people during the pandemic broadcast their own opinions about social distancing and vaccines. And I mentioned at the outset of this video that I really love Socrates. I think he's one of the greatest philosophers of all time. And are these internet science skeptics embracing the skepticism that Socrates promoted? I would argue absolutely not. If you're a random layperson who is contradicting the scientific consensus online, you're essentially saying that you know more than thousands of scientific experts. who have looked into this same theory. And as I mentioned before, scientists are inherently motivated to be skeptical. So if you really want to cast doubt upon a scientific theory, go to school and study the science for a decade and get your PhD. Then go and prove your theory about the science with an experiment and subject your experiment to peer review by experts who have decades of education and experience in the topic as well. That's really the only way to embrace scientific skepticism in the 21st century. If amateur scientific skeptics aren't doing skepticism right, the question remains, how should we incorporate skepticism into our lives? Skepticism can help inform our faith and our level of investment in belief systems that have been at least partially debunked by scientific evidence. The most obvious example is probably religious faith. For example, creation stories in Christianity appear to have been contradicted by scientific evidence repeatedly. And if the Bible is wrong about the creation story, what else can it be wrong about? Another area skepticism could help with is with people who let astrology and horoscopes influence their decisions, when efforts to test astrological predictions have not proven to be very reliable. On a similar note, some people believe in extrasensory perception and other paranormal phenomenon that aren't substantiated with empirical evidence, which is interesting if we come full circle and realize this undermines the claim that Socrates was told by an oracle that he is the wisest person in Athens, because an oracle is supposed to be someone with psychic and religious abilities. Skepticism can also help us have a healthy wariness towards ideologies. I think it's easy to get sucked into certain political ideologies, whether that's socialism or capitalism or libertarianism or anarchism, you name it. People can also become too dogmatically attached to political parties on the left and the right, whether it be Democrats or Republicans or whatever parties are in whichever country you're in. I also think that skepticism is useful in having a healthy wariness towards claims of major universal philosophical truths, especially if someone makes a claim that they know the meaning of life or some sort of universal morality or rules that we should live by. And at this point, I would make the argument that my philosophical principles, I argue, are grounded in skepticism and consistent with science. So on this channel, I advocate for a philosophy I call survivalist utilitarianism, where I recommend that the best ethical system to use to make decisions in our lives would be one that attempts to maximize our chances of survival in all of the decisions that we make. Embracing survival is consistent with the very basic sensations and perceptions that I assume we've all had. So if you review your memories, I think most people, or everyone really, will have memories of doing things that were necessary to survive until now. If you didn't do what was necessary to survive, you wouldn't be alive to watch this video. Survival is also consistent with the basic principles behind evolution. In this case, evolution is not talking about the survival of any individual animal or being, but genetic survival over generations. And evolution is one of the strongest and most studied theories in science. And importantly, with my survivalist utilitarian ethics, I'm not claiming to represent any universal or objective truth. I'm just recommending it as a practical approach that we can use to help guide us through our lives. One of the most obvious and important applications of survivalist utilitarianism is the necessity to fight for climate change mitigation. I believe this is also very much grounded in scientific evidence and therefore embraces skeptical philosophy. As mentioned before, there's over 99% scientific consensus on anthropogenic climate change. And in my climate apocalypse video, I provide a summary of the science that explore the risks associated with climate change. My conclusion is that climate change is an existential risk to our survival, and survivalist utilitarianism necessitates that we act on the scientific call to action on the climate crisis. We can be confident that dedicating our lives to this cause is probably a life well spent. I don't think there's that much in life that we can be as confident about as the need to fight climate change. In fact, I think that skepticism necessitates that we live life with humility. We have to make countless decisions every day in our lives and work. And I do think that we should try our best to ground those decisions in science and data. But we also need to be open to the fact that any of our assumptions, beliefs, and perceptions could be completely false. It's a weird balancing act. Anyway, thanks for watching this video to the end, and I'll see you in the next one.